Let's have some Sailor Jerry rum and coke here.
Cheers.
I think we're gonna need it.
Mm.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Real History. I'm your host, history professor Jared Frederick, and for this episode, I am pleased to be joined by my good friend of many years, Tom Frezza. Tom is an expert in naval history, and we are getting him a 2-for-1 deal here today. And what we are going to be doing is we're going to be taking a look at what he considers to be a bad Navy film, followed by what he thinks to be a good Navy film.
Yes.
So we're going to keep you in suspense as to what the second one is. But he and I have had many conversations about our selection for today. So, Tom, what movie did you pick, and why did you choose it for us?
Okay, so the first movie that we're going to be kind of taking a look at is Midway, and we're not talking about
the
more recent one, not the Charlton Heston one, which has its own interesting things, but the more recent one, and this is one that I consider to be a subpar Navy movie for many reasons, which we will probably get into as we go through the screening. But it's definitely an interesting one.
Well, let's not keep them in suspense any further.
Let's play it.
Let's go ahead and take a look at Midway.
The very foundations of civilization are seriously threatened. War is a contagion.
I will say this, though. I do like it when period movies begin with that sort of ominous radio broadcasting in the background. The narration of FDR here at the outset, I think it sets a tone of seriousness to the subject matter.
I mean, again, historically, the 1930s, very serious time for the world. And, yes, subtitles like these always kind of bring it in and set the tone as well.
As we're sitting through the opening credits here, it's also worthwhile to point out that this movie was directed by Roland Emmerich, who is known for Independence Day and Godzilla.
And I believe The Patriot.
And The Patriot,
yeah.
Which is another historical movie we have accosted on this channel, and rightfully so. Of his 2 historical movies that he's made, which one's worse?
Oh, boy. This is something that I have debated a lot with other historians as well. At least for The Patriot, there was not as much CGI.
Ah, okay.
And there are a lot more quotable lines from The Patriot as well. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die well dressed. With this, it's definitely not as quotable.
Okay.
There are many what people would consider to be very cheesy lines in it, which we will probably cover when we get to them. But it's The Patriot probably is a bit better.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cinematically, at least.
Yes,
Yeah.
Cinematically.
On behalf of the British Empire, I wish to thank Admiral Yamamoto for this invitation. May our nations work together to maintain peace.
I do think that these opening conversations are useful to an extent because there is this process of cultural transfer and at least attempts to understand potential allies and enemies. There were many Japanese and German officers who were visiting the United States throughout the 1930s. Tadamichi Kuribayashi, who will later defend Iwo Jima, of course, is among them, as well as Admiral Yamamoto. And I even know for a fact that Nazis were touring the Gettysburg battlefield in 1939. And the memoirs of Ulysses Grant sitting here on the Admiral's desk, it really speaks to some of those universal themes of leadership that the countries are trying to understand.
And understand each other.
We are emboldened by our invasion of China and eager to become a world power.
And this also sets the tone for the 1930s, which was a very tumultuous time. You have Spanish Civil War happening. You have conflicts in China as well.
Yes, big time.
And the world is just becoming this massive powder keg. And this is what this is kind of setting up.
Oh, you mean kind of like where we are right now?
Yes.
Yeah. Bunch of regional conflicts morphing into bigger things.
Yes.
Ugh.
Well, there's the old adage where if you don't study history, it's doomed to repeat itself.
Engine's about to die.
From the outset of the movie, Dick Best is portrayed as this maverick bad boy. And from what I understand, he was very much a consummate professional.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And incidents like this, it's definitely done for the movie itself. If you did something like this, you would definitely probably not be flying much after this. You would definitely get into a bit of trouble for hot dogging with your aircraft.
Yeah, they're sending the whole squadron into Pearl this morning. I'll be drinking a beer on the beach with Roy by noon.
And I'm not coming?
Now he's talking about taking off and flying to Pearl Harbor, which they would do with aircraft off of carriers and fly to Ford Island and land. It was much easier to have the flights go in first and land there for if there was any maintenance issues or if they had to change out different aircraft for the different flight groups. They would just send them in early, land at Ford Island, and then the carriers would come in, and then when they went back out to sea, carriers would head out first, then the aircraft would go out and then land on the carriers themselves.
So we have a little bit of cinematic deja vu here from Michael Bay.
Yes, lots of explosions, aircraft flying very low between ships, something that they probably did not do with as low as you see them flying in these scenes. And yes, they were sent in multiple waves where you would have strafing runs and then followed by torpedoes with high altitude bombers. But what you're seeing right now with torpedoes being dropped down the entire length of Battleship Row, it just didn't really happen like that. They flew over. Historically, they flew over the submarine tending areas and dropped from there because it presented more of a broadside target. It's the famous detonation of the Arizona, which the Arizona itself makes up for half of the deaths at Pearl Harbor.
About 1,200, 1,300 or so?
Around that,
Yeah.
yes. And there are definitely some slight historic problems with this scene where you have 20 millimeter guns that were never on the Arizona. You have it breaking in half and about to roll over onto the Vestal, which again, historically, the wreck is still there. They survey it all of the time. But what's about to happen with this scene where a rope is getting tossed from the Vestal to the Arizona, this did happen.
Yes.
But just not in this location. It actually happened in the forward part of the ship, the mast that leans over towards the bow. There was a gun director there. Several sailors were able to get a rope tossed to them, and went hand over the burning water to the Vestal. The rope that was tossed to them was from a chief that had been cutting lines to get the Vestal away from the ship. So, they were able to survive and were some of the last survivors off of the Arizona. Don Stratton and Lauren Brunner. They've both written books about their experiences and both have, in the past few years, passed away. But if you have a chance to read their books, phenomenal. Both of them actually went back and re-enlisted after they were able to recover from their injuries and served out their time for the rest of the war.
And I believe the character, that like the young teenage kid named Sully, I think he's supposed to be some sort of composite of Stratton and those other young men who scaled across the rope.
And there's actually several variations of that famous telegram. The reason why the Navy actually has one of the originals in their archives is because it was supposed to end up in the trash can, and somebody had the forethought to save it and keep it for the Navy because they knew this was a very historic moment.
Did we just see the Arizona partially capsizing?
Yes.
Yeah, which didn't occur.
Yes, did not occur.
Intelligence managed to get a line of bearing on the attacking fleet.
I must say, though, I like a good, gruff, and determined Dennis Quaid character.
Yes.
He does it well for Sam Houston in The Alamo, and I think he captures that sort of tough-as-nails persona of Bull Halsey in this.
The only thing that he's missing is Bull Halsey's eyebrows.
Oh, the eyebrows.
The eyebrows were so iconic.
Yeah.
We don't even know if the bastards are north or south.
Army bombers also reported a possible ship sighting here.
And this was one of the main problems that they had during the attack on Pearl Harbor, is they did not know exactly where the Japanese task force was located, because you had aircraft coming in from all different directions, but that was part of the plan, to confuse everybody as to where they were heading back to.
Swear to me, we'll make the next man in this chair listen to you.
We got a brief glimpse there of Admiral Husband Kimmel, who in so many ways becomes the scapegoat for all of this. What's your take on that? Is any of that justified, or is he truly steamrolled unjustly?
There are some things that, very few things were justified, but yes, he was steamrolled a bit. He was following the directives that were coming out of headquarters in DC. They were looking for someone to blame, and he was in command, so the blame ultimately fell on him.
When she went over, everyone below deck was probably trapped inside.
This is a scene that it did happen when the Enterprise came into Pearl, and you can see the Oklahoma rolled over, trying to get to the trapped sailors, and you can see the Arizona there burning. And it's definitely a striking scene that stayed with a lot of sailors who were on the Enterprise, because they were coming in to rearm, refuel, and then head out very soon.
One of my very astute professors as an undergrad imparted the thought to us that has remained with me, is that Pearl Harbor was a catastrophe for the Japanese, not only from a strategic perspective, but a psychological perspective in the long run, because they don't get any of the carriers, they don't hit any of the fuel depots.
And they don't hit any of the submarines.
Yeah.
Which the Philippines were a much bigger success for them. But yes, the fact that soon after this, the submarines head out and start their missions, it's the submarines are probably in the Pacific, probably one of the biggest game changers for the Americans, because they're able to effectively hold the line by sinking shipping and whatever was flying a Japanese flag in the Pacific.
We're doing our best. They've been bringing body parts and pillowcases.
Now, this is a scene where they apparently bring the officer's body off of the Arizona. The Arizona burned for days. They were not removing remains like that. And again, historically, there's accounts of when they were able to get on the ship, any of the remains that were there were ash at that point. In fact, Admiral Kidd, who was on the bridge of the Arizona when the forward magazines detonated, all they found of him was his Annapolis class ring, and it was like fused to the conning tower.
Interestingly enough, there was an alum from my high school who was like a football star at my high school in the 1930s, who was an ensign on the Arizona, and his name was George Wolfe. And like well over 1,000 others, he's still entombed in the Arizona today. Something that intrigues me about the scene here in the streets of Japan is that FDR's declaration of war is playing over the radio. And I wonder if that's something that even would have made it through censors in Japan. Why would you give your enemy this sort of platform in this totalitarian regime? So I somehow doubt that that's something that they would have been hearing on commercial radios.
And was Yamamoto back in Japan at that point when the speech was given? What they're talking about here with the Japanese Navy and Army, they always were competing with each other for control of different combat scenarios, for supplies. It was a constant competition right up until the very end.
Mm-hmm.
We have 3 carriers. The Japs have 10.
The line where he says that we only have 3 carriers, he's talking about just in the Pacific. We did have more carriers, but they were over on the Atlantic. And soon after this, you do see a transfer of some of those carriers to the Pacific, but it does take time for them to get
sure
there.
Does, yeah. So the casting of Woody Harrelson as Chester Nimitz, I always thought was a very interesting one. And I, on more than one occasion, I've had the chance to talk with historian Craig Simons, who has written probably what's the best book on Admiral Nimitz during World War II, entitled Nimitz at War. And I asked him what his thoughts were, and how I phrased it to him was, did he prefer Henry Fonda or Woody Harrelson as Chester Nimitz? And to my surprise, he chose Woody Harrelson.
Really?
Yeah, because he thought Henry Fonda's version of Nimitz, seen in the 1970s equivalent of this movie, offers a kind of a grandfatherly homespun Nimitz, which he was to an extent. But in this movie, we get a more decisive and sharper Nimitz.
Yes, which he definitely was. Very decisive, very sharp, because he's someone who came up through the ranks of the Navy by doing the hard jobs and everything, and knew about leadership from his days as a young commanding officer of a destroyer, going up to become in charge of the Pacific Fleet. He was a very decisive leader.
I think one of the other things that makes him effective is, and Simons alludes to this in his book, and that is the fact that he reads history.
Yes.
He's incredibly well-versed, not only in U.S. history, not only naval history, but world history as well. So he had a very global view of a very global war, and that empowers him in a very big way.
And that decisiveness and the idea of bringing the fight to the enemy and that global view also leads him to clash with another commander in the Pacific by the name of MacArthur many times throughout the war.
I'm the intelligence officer responsible for overseeing the greatest intelligence failure in American history.
I recall something from one of the movie trailers where one of the officers says to Nimitz, "Washington is wrong." Very melodramatic. And they actually took that out of the movie.
Really?
Yeah, that line does not end up in the film, even though that it was in the trailer. And I thought, well, good, because actually a lot of the cues from Washington were right on the money.
Yeah.
As the problem was often is that they weren't being disseminated at the ground level where they were needed to be received most.
Yes. That and some of the leaders on the ground had their own interpretation of what they were receiving from Washington. parking the aircraft at Pearl wingtip to wingtip, and same thing in the Philippines, and the indecisiveness of some of the leaders to not do that. You can look back at them and say, what were they thinking? But it's all up to their own interpretation of what was coming to them.
Start your run, boys. Engage torpedoes.
You have those famous torpedo aircraft that looked like they were made out of corrugated tin. And sadly, there's none of those aircraft left today. Recently, when they found the wreck of it wasn't Saratoga, it was Lexington. They found some of those aircraft on the bottom, and there's been talk of some folks would like to bring up those aircraft, but they're so deep down. I don't think that'll really happen. What you see here on the Dauntless are the speed brakes that have come out. It's supposed to slow down the aircraft enough and make it a bit more steady as they're going into their dive runs. And the arm that swings down with the bombs, that was a design feature on the Dauntless and several other dive bombers afterwards that would keep the bomb, when they released, from dropping through the propeller. Because if you lost your propeller on a propeller-driven aircraft, you were in some trouble. It showcases Dauntless dive bombers pulling some maneuvers that I'm not entirely sure that they can do.
Get those bastards off me, Murray!
And while the pilots were officers, the rear gunners there were enlisted sailors. It was their job to keep the tail clear for those pilots. So the scene that you're seeing here actually did happen. So the junior enlisted sailor that you're seeing run over to the aircraft, I'm trying to remember his name again. It's
Bruno Guido.
Bruno Guido, yes. He this did happen, where he hopped into the back of a Dauntless, and it was documented as happening, and he was able to hit it enough that it missed the Enterprise, but it did somewhat strike, not in as a dramatic fashion as you're seeing here.
Not in slow motion.
Yes, but he was able to make this happen, and Halsey did meet with him, and I believe gave him a battlefield promotion.
Nick Jonas saves the day.
There he is, with a mustache that Bruno actually did not have.
I mean, these mustaches always look the part. Very Clark Gable-like.
Yeah. I know, I probably shouldn't be saying anything, but
When I think of movies like this as a commercial product, and you think about, well, why is somebody like Nick Jonas in a movie like this? He doesn't sing or anything like that. And I have no doubt that they are trying to replicate the success that Dunkirk had by putting Harry Styles into a movie, because you reach potentially a whole new demographic.
Yes.
Particularly teenage girls who otherwise wouldn't go see this movie.
Yes.
But they want to go see their hunk on the big screen.
Yes.
So I have no doubt that that's probably why
It
Nick
would
Jonas.
not be surprising, but I'm sure that if you asked girls who are big fans of a singer like him, did you see him in Midway? I do not have high hopes for their response.
Yeah. Well, conversely, when Pearl Harbor came out, a bunch of my female classmates went to see it because, Ben Affleck and Josh Hartnett were in it. And as a result, they knew what the USS Arizona was, and they knew about Pearl Harbor, and they otherwise wouldn't have. So, as you have alluded to, sometimes we got to give every devil their due a little bit for sparking interest, even if it does mislead people in the process.
Yes.
I do think one of the strengths of the movie is the production design, because I find these to be very authentic sets.
Yes.
Like these clubs, these offices, these galleys, whatever, they seem very real to me. They seem like habited spaces of the time period.
The non-CGI ones.
Yeah.
And even the uniforms and clothing in this are they
I
have
think
done
they look pretty good. I think, yeah.
a decent job. But this movie is starting to delve into the realm of other historic movies where there's almost too many storylines.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yes. And more recently, Ridley Scott's Napoleon kind of suffers from that same excess.
Greatly.
That sometimes these historical films bite off more than they can chew.
Yes.
And I think like the gold standard example of how to make a historical epic, especially a biopic, is Steven Spielberg's Lincoln. Like,
yes. Look at
condense
one section of
and
time.
make it emblematic of the bigger picture here. But because in this movie, as we're going to be seeing, we have Pearl Harbor, we have some of the counteraction activity, we have the Coral Sea, we have the Doolittle raid, and all of that
leads
happens.
up to Midway.
Yeah, is it too much?
I would say yes. And you also have this problem with some of the historic miniseries too, where again, there's just too many intersecting storylines. But yes, this may be suffering from that as well.
Yeah, it's not Gods and Generals though. Oh, shots fired.
Oh, yes. And this movie does at least recognize the fact that naval intelligence were the ones who were able to work on breaking the Japanese code to figure out where fleets were going to be at. It's a part of the Midway story that sometimes gets greatly overlooked, which is why I'm glad that they're showing that in this.
Every mile we get Doolittle closer to Japan is fuel he can use to get the hell out of there. But I'm not going to risk these carriers.
So the Navy was hoping to get these B-25s about 500 miles to Japan, but they're discovered 150 miles further out from that, which means inevitably that all of them are going to have to ditch their planes. And I believe only one or two of the bombers actually made it to a landing strip. One of them makes it to Siberia.
Yes, where the crew is interred for the rest of the war. But and Doolittle also is one of those who bails out of his bomber when it runs out of fuel. But this was a mission that was something that had never been done before. It was something that the Japanese were not expecting. And it was also a massive morale boost for the United States as a whole. Because up to this point, we've been on the defensive. This was a chance to go on the offensive, be it a small little sting.
Yeah, the amount of damage that it inflicts is negligible. But when you think about the psychological impact of it, it's not to be underestimated.
Of course, he has to fly through the water, and while the water is choppy, it's not that choppy.
Yeah, no, it was a horrible day as far as weather was concerned. This is not the first time that the Doolittle raid has received the Hollywood treatment. It's a subplot in the movie. Pearl Harbor, Alec Baldwin plays Jimmy Doolittle. If you go way, way back, though, you can check out what I think is the best of all the depictions, and that is 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, in which Spencer Tracy portrays Jimmy Doolittle. And what's so great about that one is, of course, they use real planes because there is no CGI, and they were readily available. And the Army Air Forces cooperated fully, as they often did with those older films. So if you haven't seen 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, based on a book of the same title, that's one that you definitely have to put on your reading list.
I don't know if we're over Chinese or Jap territory. Watch yourselves.
And several of the flyers who were captured by the Japanese from the Doolittle raid were either imprisoned, a few were executed by the Japanese.
Yeah, like 5 or 8 of them were.
Yeah. Of course, it wouldn't be a Pacific World War II movie that features the Japanese if it didn't have the Yamato-style battleship, which Yamamoto actually did use as his flagship.
Mm-hmm. Yamamoto was indeed devastated in the aftermath of the Doolittle raid. It infuriated him, it shocked him, and it's ultimately his desire for retribution which will ultimately spur what becomes known as the Midway campaign.
Yes.
You bomb Japan?
I do like this interaction that Doolittle's character has with the Chinese, because I would argue most Americans don't have a clue the toll that the Chinese paid throughout this war. Upward of 20 million people, right up there with the Soviet Union in regard to the number of people who were lost. And indeed, a number of the Chinese put themselves in great risk and put their neighbors at risk by sheltering and giving aid and transportation to these downed American airmen. And sadly, and what the movie alludes to at a later point, the Americans would leave them gifts, cigarettes, cigarette lighters, candy bars, pins, hats, silk from their chutes if possible. And then those became bits of incriminating evidence later on when the Japanese are looking for them. And some of the very high estimates indicate that perhaps well over 200,000 Chinese lost their lives in retribution for perhaps a few dozen or a few hundred of them taking care of the Doolittle raiders. So when you look at the cost-benefit analysis of the number of Allied people lost in reaction to the Doolittle raid, when we put on our global thinking caps here, rather than looking at it through American versus Japanese lens, can we really say that it was successful?
Really, if you look at it from that standpoint, probably not. With the how much the Chinese suffered in retribution from it, and again the campaigns in China, really China in the Pacific is overlooked in general a lot for World War II.
And even though we do talk about how excessive this movie is, I kind of am glad that it shows this dimension, because it hardly gets any recognition in the broad scheme of things. All that said, some Chinese companies helped to fund this film.
Yes.
And so perhaps that was one of the stipulations that, hey, you got to show our contribution to all of this too. I do think Aaron Eckhart is good casting for Jimmy Doolittle. Kind of has the little dimple in his chin. He's a bit too tall. And he needs to be bald.
Yes, I was about to say that. He has a little bit too much hair.
If they had cut his hair more, he would be perfect, I think.
But the history of Doolittle before World War II is interesting. He was helping to design airplanes, was racing
had
aircraft.
A doctorate from MIT. Aeronautical engineering.
He again, where everybody remembers him for the raid, but there should be a biopic on him, not even for his war service, but his interwar activities.
This leaves us and Hornet as the only carriers in the Pacific.
The aftermath of the Battle of Coral Sea here, where USS Lexington sinks, which she was originally designed to be a battle cruiser from World War I, was converted into an aircraft carrier along with the Saratoga, and how many hits that aircraft carrier took to actually sink was massive. But with that carrier being lost, it did only leave us with two carriers in the Pacific, and one of them was the Yorktown, which was grievously wounded.
Right.
And now they have to run back to Pearl and hopefully make some repairs.
You are now in charge of the air group.
And this also goes into the early days of World War II, where they're changing up flight groups and everything on the fly. Where that in battle groups on the fly, where before it was always going to be battleship against battleship, with those battleships gone, the aircraft carrier becomes the center of the task group, and you have all of the other vessels supporting the carriers.
Yeah. And the Coral Sea and Midway are two of the first instances, if not the first instances, where the two opposing vessel forces, if you will,
never see each other.
Don't see each other, yeah.
And Coral Sea is one of those battles where, again, they don't see each other. Nobody's really sure what's happening, and they're just sending out pilots left and right to try to find the ships and sink them.
Yeah.
And there's no good organization in this battle. Yeah. But these battles, basically leading up to this point, are stalling actions for the Americans. They're trying to keep the Japanese from gaining more territory, and it's about to come to a head, if you will.
And the Battle of the Coral Sea is not an outright American victory, and certainly they lost a lot of people and hardware. But it does show that the Americans can hold their own.
Yes.
And it prevents the Japanese from completely conquering New Guinea.
Yes.
Which would have been a major staging area for them had they succeeded.
And this is where you see, again, the military and intelligence coming in. They're starting to break the Japanese codes, but they know the Japanese are about to do another assault, but they don't know where.
Sorry, Admiral, it gets cold down here in the dungeon.
These Navy code breakers were kind of creatures of their own, if you will. They had some of the toughest jobs out there, and again, the man that you're seeing now was referenced a lot for what he's doing now, wearing a bathrobe and slippers and working all sorts of odd hours, and he had probably one of the toughest jobs in the Pacific.
Yeah.
Because he was getting it not only from Washington, but everybody was coming to him for information. And I think after Midway, they forced him to take a break for a while.
But yeah, Rochefort's unorthodox methods and rather casual demeanor, though, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And Nimitz says as much.
Yeah. See, this would have been a good scene because Admiral Nimitz, a lot of people don't know this, was missing a good section of one of his fingers, where there's enough CGI in this movie. They could have, CGI'd one of Woody Harrelson's fingers off.
He, a bit of useless trivia here, he also had really bad teeth. He was missing some teeth.
Yes.
And that's why he never smiles in any of his photos.
Yes, Halsey, at this point, was suffering greatly from shingles, which is extremely painful. And you also have to, since Pearl Harbor, he's been overworked.
Yeah, chomping at the bit.
Yes. And this is when he basically will get forced to stay behind and to take some R&R to get better.
The target of their upcoming attack is out of fresh water.
Midway accidentally sent out an unencrypted transmission that their water plant was broken. But that proves Midway is AF.
And this historically did happen.
Yes.
That is how they broke the code.
Yes. The problem was they knew that AF, the code name, was a target, but they didn't know if it was Midway or the Aleutians.
Yes.
And the Japanese sensed this, and so they sent a diversionary force toward the Aleutians. And so, but this spurious note about the water purification system being out, the water system being out on Midway, is what caught them in the trap, and the ambush is reversed.
Yes. And this gives Nimitz the way to set up the screen and hopefully catch him surprised. And then you see Midway itself, which today there's not much on the island. There's a weather station and a lot of Goonie birds.
Mm-hmm.
Can't say, Mr. Ford, that I've ever helped a big-time Hollywood director scout for a movie before.
John Ford being sent to Midway.
Yeah, just at the right time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's never really, unless you're a fan of classic Hollywood, you really don't have any idea who this guy is, though.
Yes.
There's not really a lot of context to give. You have to kind of be in the know to have a sense of why it's significant that this Academy Award-winning author, or director rather, is here capturing this.
And he wasn't just sent there out of the blue, as they're kind of, alluding to here. The Navy knew what was going on, and he somewhat knew what was going on, which is why they sent him out to Midway with the film crew.
And you can watch the entirety of his documentary on YouTube today, because it was produced for the government. It's in the public domain, and it's readily accessible.
And there's also the documentary that came out recently about him and other directors as well, called And Five Came Back.
Five Came Back, yes, which is excellent.
Well done.
Very good Netflix documentary.
I don't care if you need to patch the deck with plywood. Yorktown sails in 72 hours.
Yes, and this is where we see USS Yorktown at Pearl Harbor in the dry dock. She had taken a bomb to one of to the flight deck, and I believe it damaged one of the elevators, aircraft elevators, and they wanted to send her back stateside to be worked on.
Yeah.
And as Nimitz is saying, he needs the ship because he knows what's coming. And he's like, well, how much time do you need? We need like a long time in dry dock. And again, you have 72 hours.
Yeah, and they did it in less than 72
Yes.
hours, what, like 68,
Well,
67 hours?
When she went to sea, she still had civilian dockyard
my
workers
God.
on her, along with sailors off
Well.
of the repair ship USS Vestal, still doing work on her. So those civilians were on her for the battle.
I didn't know that.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
They're in for a hell of a ride.
Yes.
Wow.
I've given command of Task Force 16 to Admiral Spruance. We're setting a trap.
So now we're introduced to Raymond Spruance.
Yes, because Halsey has been taken out of the fight because of his shingles. Spruance is placed in command. And again, he's kind of unsure of the plan, but they're going to go forward with it. And Spruance is definitely someone who steps up to the challenge.
Mm-hmm. He's the John Buford
Yes.
of the Battle of Midway. Sent out there to find them, not 100% certain where they are, but he's the one who picks the moment and the place.
This is good ground.
Yes.
Landing on a carrier was, even today, with all the technology that we have, it can be tricky.
Yeah. And there's no shortage of archival footage showing mishap landings on a flat top.
Though what's funny is the sailors wearing their whites. Really, you wouldn't see them doing that. They would probably be in their chambray shirts and dungarees and everything. Nimitz was kind of famous for that, where he did away with the ties and the chokers, if you will. So seeing a corpsman wearing his whites is like, maybe not.
You can dress down somebody.
Yes, just a little bit. So you have the start of Midway here with with all of the flyers taking off from the island. They also sent out all of the B-17s that were there too, the Army B-17s. Yeah, here you have Mr. Ford setting up his shots, and again, if you watch his film footage, you see the American flag waving, and he does capture Japanese aircraft and the Marines defending the island.
Yeah.
Probably not as many aircraft as what you
That's
see.
a lot of planes.
This is a lot.
It's like Star Wars.
Yeah. But Ford and his team do maybe not that badly do get concussed from several close hits, and which you can see in the film footage. The headquarters back in Hawaii is getting the information. They're trying to get it to the fleet. The fleet is sending out aircraft to hopefully find the Japanese strike group, and it's all about time and communication.
Mm.
But here comes all of the CGI. And you see so many aircraft getting shot down in large numbers where they really, while they did lose a lot of aircraft, it's not as many as what you see.
Not in such quick succession.
Yes.
Is what we see here, you're saying. And as we see some Marauders, I believe,
Yes.
who are coming on the scene here. There were also some B-17s that had been dispatched
Yes.
but didn't do too well at the outset.
No, because they were doing, again, high-altitude bombing, and as you can see, the Japanese were able to maneuver their vessels pretty easily to get out of the way of those high-altitude bombers. And again, if this was... I'm not sure if this technically happened, and if anything, it probably wasn't purposefully done. If this is something that actually happened, and it's with these scenes that you could probably play a game of bingo or a drinking game where it's the most cliche lines in a lot of these movies.
Well, let's toast to that.
Yes.
to cliched lines.
Indeed.
Cheers.
Still owe me $10. Trying to collect before I get myself shot down?
There you go.
We got a carrier, maybe 4,000 yards.
Sir, the jets are right on us.
Make tubes 1 and 2 ready.
And then you have USS Nautilus, which, again, submarines, while they were doing damage early on, they had a lot of problems with their torpedoes where they were trying to use magnetic detonators, which just were not that reliable. And it wasn't until a bit later into later 42 into 1943 where they switched to contact detonators, where after that you see more tonnage being sunk. So you're going to see, the Nautilus try to fire a torpedo, and you saw earlier in this movie as well where even the aerial torpedoes would hit the sides of the ships and not do anything.
In referencing the Nautilus, though, I think it's one of the characteristics that makes the Battle of Midway so fascinating because it's happening below the water, on the water, and above the water.
Yes.
Which is one of the first times in human history that that's happened.
And there's a very good reason for including the Nautilus, because the Nautilus causes a diversion where several Japanese ships will stay behind the task force trying to sink the Nautilus, and they don't. And then they go to head to catch back up to the fleet. The dive bombers get lost, and it's because of those ships that stayed behind to try to hit the Nautilus, their wakes in heading back to the fleet. The dive bombers come across that and are able to follow those ships right to the main fleet. And again, one of the inaccuracies, if your periscope is up, you're not that far under the surface, and they're showing a destroyer going right over the top of them. They would probably have there probably would have been a collision. And the Nautilus wasn't like a Baleo class sub, which was this was a much larger submarine too. So she did not maneuver fast. She did not go, up and down too quickly either.
You okay, sir? My oxygen. Must have gotten a bad mix.
Did Dick Best actually suffer from oxygen poisoning? Did he get a bad mix as is described here?
He did, but if it happened during Midway, from the things, if I'm remembering it correctly, it's something that happened well after the battle.
The heat of the battle, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And those torpedo bombers suffered greatly during Midway, mostly because they went in with no other cover, and they're flying low and slow and trying to set up their torpedo runs in aircraft that were designed, you know, well before World War II.
Mm-hmm. You know, I'd say one thing that this scene gets right to an extent. Sometimes the speed is really overdone in a lot of aircraft in World War II. You really get the sense that these planes are a little bit slower in some of these shots.
Yeah. Torpedo Squadron 8 is, again, another very sad story from Midway, where there was only one survivor, Ensign George Gay, and they all, again, went in low and slow to try to drop their torpedoes, and with Gay being the only survivor, it was quite devastating. And John Ford, who was on Midway, actually took film footage of Torpedo Squadron 8 and made a movie for all of their families about them. And distributed it just to the families initially, and then it went for a bit of a wider release.
What do you want to bet she's trying to catch up with the carriers?
And it's kind of interesting, they're taking off their oxygen masks to talk. Again, probably a Hollywoodism, if you will, because if you look at their necks, what they have on them are throat mics, which are designed so that, you know, all of the sound when you're talking comes out of your throat.
Yeah.
So if you have a microphone right there, you don't need to take off your oxygen mask for people to understand you.
It's so the audience know who's talking to whom.
Yes.
Yeah.
Gay was in the water and watched the Japanese fleet all around him getting attacked by all of these aircraft, and witnessed Midway right from the water.
Yeah. He only gets a brief tip of the hat in this film. He has a much larger role in the 1970s film.
Here come the dive bombers. And again, with the torpedo bombers, everybody was focused on them coming in low and slow at the waterline, but nobody was really looking up, which gave the dive bombers this massive opportunity. And you also have aircraft being rearmed and refueled within the Japanese carriers, so it's kind of the prime time for a dive bomber to attack. And again, those oxygen masks disappear, and
we have to be able to see them grit their teeth.
Yes,
you know,
get thwapped in the eye by their chin strap.
Yeah.
And were they that low when they were pulling up? Again, dramatic effect, but yes, those carriers were getting swarmed by dive bombers left and right.
One or two historians' reviews that I've read in regard to scenes like this, is it a little bit overdone here? I mean, like
how much anti-aircraft fire is going up?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot.
Yes, but
but is it completely like blot out the sun?
Probably not. Or like were they almost scraping the decks as they were pulling up? Probably not.
So here comes one of the big climactic moments of the movie where Bess gets into like a jousting duel.
Yes.
Almost. What was Dick Best in reality up to, and is this an accurate reflection of his actions that day?
Most likely not. Not what you see here. Yes, it was a very tough and challenging day, but for the amount of fire that he's going through, again, while they were throwing up a lot of anti-aircraft fire, this is probably a
embellishment.
Definitely an embellishment. But it was a challenging thing to do, trying to fly through all of this flak and drop a bomb on target. Again, his wingman probably, yes, did drop way too soon, but he definitely drops in this movie way too late. For a pilot like Best, he, probably dropped it at the level that he was supposed to and fly out of there safely. Again, very late.
Yes. I don't think the anti-aircraft fire would even be able to shoot that low.
No. And I'm sorry, if your wingtip is hitting the water like that, you're going swimming.
Yeah.
And then, of course, having to dive the different geysers and everything as well.
It's a true Death Star moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, another frustrating moment where he flies through on that Japanese ship. There are wires,
cables and wires.
Cables.
Yeah.
Oh boy. And those hits that the Japanese carriers took were devastating for several reasons. One, they were some of them were rearming aircraft below decks, not on the flight decks as some people.
Yes, Fuchida. Spreads that myth.
Yeah. But as you can see, power gets knocked out. Their firefighting systems are out, and then
the whole air is just gasoline. The fumes.
So as soon as the munitions start cooking off, it's massively devastating.
Yeah.
And when the wrecks of the carriers were found, and then just last year in 2023, NOAA went out and actually surveyed the wrecks. It was NOAA or Woods Hole
in his ARC.
Yes. Yeah.
National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I know.
Help. I'm sorry.
But they surveyed the wrecks, and when Ballard found the Yorktown, she's in relatively good condition for a ship that sank, where the Japanese carriers are just devastated wrecks in pieces all over the place. And it really shows the damage and the severity of the damage that they took when their munitions and fuel just started detonating.
And there's nothing more dreadful for a pilot than losing your home. Either losing your airstrip or your carrier.
Yeah, because for the Americans, there were other carriers that they could go to, or if they had enough fuel, they could go to Midway if they had enough fuel, which a lot of them did not.
Doesn't O'Flaherty survive? Don't they keep him? And they just do it to...
No, they actually did it to the both.
Okay.
Yes.
How do we know about it then?
The reason why we know about it is because one, other flyers write about this happening. Dusty Cleese is one of them, and also Japanese survivors and records. Now, the destroyer this happens on does not survive the war, so very few crew members actually are able to survive to talk about it. But there are records from the Japanese talking about this happening. Now, the Yorktown does get hit by a bomb just behind the main stack and the island on the carrier. And again, the wreck surveys that they have done show where the bomb hit, but it wasn't that devastating of a hit. So she could definitely survive it. It just slowed her down a bit, which gave the torpedo planes that were coming in a chance to hit the Yorktown, which they do.
This is for Pearl.
Yeah, there we go.
This is for Pearl.
Yep. Of course, the fireball has to wrap around them, and then they come out of it. And of course, it harkens back to the beginning of the movie where he says, "Oh, our flaps are shot away and our engine's dead." So yeah, you have to look back on that.
To what extent did he suffer damage? Is this in any degree reflective of reality?
Not. They're definitely showing more damage than what he really suffered. Again, while he did suffer, somewhat of a poisoning from a bad oxygen bottle, I'm gonna have to go back and look, but I believe that this was after Midway where this happens. But historically, that did happen to him. And then you have, again, Japanese, the carriers were burning all through this, and they were basically lost. And Admiral Yamaguchi, I believe, is who's going to be talking, decides to go down with his vessel. And he was one of those commanders that Yamamoto was really reliant upon. And with his loss, it was a devastating blow to the Japanese Navy.
I do appreciate this scene because it gives us a sense of empathy. And even though, to an extent, some of the heinous actions of the Japanese are depicted in this movie, you can't help but to empathize with them in cases like this. And I wonder if, had the movie refocused its concentration a little bit, maybe we could have done without Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea in here, and maybe we could have actually focused on a Japanese pilot.
Yes.
There are no Japanese airmen who have any sort of notable role in this movie, and I think it would have offered a very helpful and balanced approach to get some of their perspective too. I think that's what makes Tora 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 such a great movie.
Yeah. Or instead of single pilots, you're focusing on the actions of the Enterprise in this movie. Why not focus on the action of one carrier with, like, under the command of Yamaguchi, if you will.
It just so happens that I think the USS Enterprise should be the subject of the next Hanks Spielberg miniseries.
Yes.
Because if you want Band of Brothers at Sea, an outfit that was everywhere throughout the war,
yes,
that is the story.
The Enterprise was one of 3 carriers built before the war that survived the entire war. And it's one of those sad stories of, like, she should have become a museum ship, but the funding just was not there. But several years ago, when the History Channel was still doing history documentaries, they did a Battle 360 on just the Enterprise. And it was phenomenally done. And it was sponsored by Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which the guy who started that company was a sailor from the Enterprise, which is where they got the name from. But
then its namesake gets to go into deep space then too.
Yeah, yes, that it does. Well, what's kind of cool is that there's never been a time in the Navy's history that we've not had an Enterprise within the Navy. So they actually took portholes off of CV-6 and then put them onto CVN-65. And when she was decommissioned, the Navy went on and took those portholes, and they're going to go onto the next Enterprise, which is currently being built.
Oh, wow, that's neat.
You boys really came through for us.
Yes, naval intelligence, the unsung heroes. But Spruance, what's kind of interesting about him is that soon after this battle, there's different types of fitness reports, command fitness reports that officers have to go through. And one was done on him, and he had just won the Battle of Midway, and he was given a satisfactory rating, which is like a mid-range rating and everything. And it's like, he just won this massive battle. Yeah.
So I did see this movie in theaters. And, people got kind of emotional here at the coda, as often the case when they compare the characters with their real-life personas. And people applauded at the end. And I realized they aren't necessarily applauding the movie per se, but they're applauding the story.
Yes.
They're applauding the people who are being depicted here.
The historic individuals.
Right,
yeah.
right. So that wraps up our assessment of Midway. And, just to play a little bit of a contrarian view, I don't dislike this movie as much as you do. I think to an extent it does capture some of the complexity. There's a lot of moving pieces to this battle. And even though it certainly embellishes and exaggerates to a fair degree, I don't think it necessarily does it to the point that it dishonors the participants. What do you think?
I agree with that. It definitely does not dishonor them, but it could have been done better. Again, there were too many intertwining storylines. There were too many cliche lines throughout it where... And they also put into the movie a lot of things that historically were not possible or just did not happen whatsoever. So they're very, a lot of easily fact-checked things that could have been caught early on if they had someone, a historian working for them who, would just say like, you might want to tweak that a little bit.
Fair enough.
I understand with all of the CGI because, granted, you don't have all of these aircraft flying today. You don't have the ships available to you today. But
I don't think there's a single real plane in this whole movie.
No,
which is a bit disappointing. Yeah,
it really is. But the aircraft that are around today are in museums, or there's just not enough of them in the numbers that they would need to shoot an epic like this. So I guess the only thing that I would add to this is that if you're really interested in learning about the Battle of Midway, there's plenty of publications, there's plenty of documentaries out there too that really cover the battle. And Midway also, and I would love your take on this, a lot of people think that Midway is the turning point of the war in the Pacific, where my thoughts are, it's not. It's the start of the turning point.
Okay.
But the real turning point is one of the last naval battles off of Guadalcanal.
Okay.
Where you have the battleships Washington and South Dakota basically turning back the Japanese fleet from landing supplies and more Japanese military on the island of Guadalcanal. And that after that point, the U.S. is more on an offensive footing, where Coral Sea, Midway, and other naval battles off of Guadalcanal
are prologue to that.
And they're basically, again, more stalling, but they're stopping, and then that battle is the turning point. What
I mean, I always think of the Marianas Turkey Shoot as a huge turning point. Talk about a lopsided victory that pretty much annihilates a huge contingent of the Japanese ability to wage war in the Pacific. So I too think of that as a turning point as well.
Yeah. Well, everybody has different opinions about it, but as long as you...
But Gettysburg is the turning point of the American Civil War.
Yes.
One of the turning points, yeah. So before we head out, as always, we like to recommend additional reading. And this one is just really great, and that is the memoir by Jack Dusty Clyce. Every aviator needs a good good nickname, and this is most certainly a good one. Never Call Me a Hero, co-written by
Timothy and Laura Orr,
who are acquaintances of ours.
Yes,
yeah,
and it's very well written, and if they if they focused on, if they wanted to make a Midway movie with like one person in mind, it should be Dusty.
Yeah.
He saw more action than Dick Best and actually put more bombs on target than Dick Best.
Yeah. So definitely, this is one to check out.
And if you want to read more information from the Japanese perspective, I would definitely recommend Shattered Sword, The Untold Story of the Battle of Midway. And this one is written by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully. It's very technical.
Very in-depth.
Very, very in-depth and technical, but it gives you a better mindset of where the Japanese were coming from. It goes into the how the carriers were built and their firefighting apparatuses too, why they saw such devastation from those bomb hits. It's very technical. It's not as easy a read as, say, Never Call Me a Hero, but if you're really interested in learning about the technical aspect of it, well worth the read.
And I'd say if you're a naval officer, like this is definitely one that you have to read, because there's a lot of lessons of both success and failure. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Real History. Tom, thank you so much for lending your expertise to this episode. But stay tuned, because he's going to be joining us for a follow-up, and we're going to be examining your favorite naval movie, possibly?
Definitely one of the tops.
Okay, so we have a much kinder assessment for our next episode. So stay tuned. In the meantime, please hit that subscribe button below, leave a comment, share your thoughts on this movie, and we'll see you next time on Real History.